The desert sand felt like shattered glass beneath my boots. It was 2009, somewhere in the Helmand Province of Afghanistan, and I was about to make the biggest mistake of my military career. Or so I thought. My name is Marcus Webb, and for 6 years, I served as a reconnaissance sniper with the United States Marine Corps. I had 43 confirmed kills. 43 times, I'd looked through a scope and made the decision to end a life. 43 times I'd pulled that trigger without hesitation, because that's what the mission demanded. That's what my training had drilled into me. But on this particular day, everything I thought I knew about being a soldier was about to be challenged. Our team had been inserted 3 days earlier. The mission was straightforward. Locate and eliminate a high-value target known only as the Engineer. Intelligence suggested he was responsible for building the improvised explosive devices that had killed over 200 coalition soldiers in the past 18 months. 200 families who would never see their loved ones again. 200 flag-draped coffins. This wasn't just another mission. This was personal for every one of us. My spotter, Corporal Danny Reeves, was positioned beside me on the ridge. We'd been lying in the same position for 11 hours, barely moving, barely breathing. The sun had baked us during the day, and now the temperature was dropping fast as evening approached. This is what people don't understand about combat. It's not constant action and explosions, like in the movies. It's 99% waiting, watching and enduring discomfort that would break most people. Movement 2 o'clock, Danny whispered, his eye pressed against the spotting scope. I adjusted my position slightly, bringing my rifle around. Through my scope, I could see figures emerging from a compound about 800 meters away. Intelligence had been tracking the Engineer to this location for weeks. This was our window. I've got 3 military-aged males, Danny continued, his voice calm and measured. One matches the description. 6-foot, black beard, wearing a gray tunic. My crosshairs found the target. There he was, the man who had perfected the art of killing from a distance. Just like me, except his weapons were buried in the ground, waiting for unsuspecting patrols. Mine was in my hands. Wind is calm. Range 800 meters. You're good to engage, Danny said. My finger moved to the trigger. This was it. One squeeze, and the Engineer's reign of terror would end. One more number added to my tally. One more threat eliminated. But then something happened that had never happened before. A child ran into view. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old, wearing a bright blue dress that stood out against the tan and brown of the desert landscape. She ran to the man in the gray tunic, and he scooped her up in his arms, spinning her around. Even from 800 meters away, I could see she was laughing. Do you have the shot? Danny asked. I did. I absolutely had the shot. The rules of engagement were clear. This was a confirmed hostile, and collateral damage, while regrettable, was sometimes unavoidable in war. I could take the shot while he held the child, or I could wait for her to move away. But something stopped me. Negative, I said. Child in proximity. I'm holding. Copy that, Danny replied. We watched for another 20 minutes. The man played with the girl, then handed her off to a woman who appeared from inside the compound. My window was opening again. Clear, Danny said. But now, there were 2 other children playing in the courtyard. Boys maybe 9 and 11 years old. They were kicking a ball made of wrapped cloth and string. The man in the gray tunic watched them play. He clapped when one of the boys scored a goal against an imaginary opponent. He was smiling. Webb, what are you waiting for? Danny asked. That was the question, wasn't it? What was I waiting for? I'd taken shots under worse conditions. I'd engaged targets in populated areas before. This was war, and in war, the mission comes first. That's what they taught us. That's what separated professional soldiers from amateurs, the ability to make the hard decisions. Something's not right, I finally said. What do you mean? That's our guy, is it? I asked. Run the description again. Danny consulted his notes. 6 foot tall, black beard, gray tunic, approximately 40 years old. I looked through my scope again. Danny, that description matches about 10,000 men in this province. Intelligence confirmed. Intelligence makes mistakes, I interrupted. Have we positively identified this target? Have we seen him do anything that confirms he's the engineer? There was silence beside me. Danny was one of the best spotters I'd ever worked with, and he knew I was right. We'd been so focused on finding the engineer that we'd accepted the first match we found. What are you thinking? Danny asked. I'm thinking we need to be sure. This was not how snipers operated. Once you had a target in your sights, once command had given you the green light, you took the shot. Hesitation got people killed. Hesitation meant the enemy slipped away. But I couldn't shake the image of that little girl spinning in his arms. Request confirmation of target identity, I said into my radio. The response crackled back after a moment. Overwatch 2, you have a confirmed hostile in your sights. You are authorized to engage. Roger that, I replied, but I'm requesting additional confirmation. Has this individual been positively identified through facial recognition or direct observation of hostile activity? There was a longer pause this time. I could imagine the frustration at the Tactical Operations Center. Some trigger-happy sniper questioning his orders. Overwatch 2. Identification is based on signal intelligence tracking to this location and physical description match. That's all the confirmation you're getting. Take the shot. Signal intelligence. That meant they'd tracked a phone or radio signal to this compound. But what if the engineer had switched devices? What if he'd passed his phone to someone else? What if the intelligence was simply wrong? Negative, I said. I need positive visual confirmation before engaging. The radio exploded with angry voices. I was disobeying a direct order. I was jeopardizing the mission. I was letting emotions cloud my judgment. Danny looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Marcus, what are you doing? This is our shot. Then you take it, I said, moving aside from my rifle. Danny didn't move because he knew I was right to question this. We stay on target, I said. We watch and we confirm. So that's what we did. For the next 2 days we watched that compound. We catalogued every person who entered and left. We photographed faces. We documented behaviors. And slowly, a different picture began to emerge. The man in the gray tunic was a farmer. He had a small plot of land behind a compound where he grew vegetables. Every morning, he would work the field. Every afternoon, he would play with his children. Every evening, he would sit with the other men from nearby compounds and drink tea. He wasn't the engineer. On the 3rd day of observation, we saw something else. A different man arrived at a neighboring compound. He was shorter, thinner, with a closely trimmed beard. He arrived in a truck loaded with what looked like farming supplies. But the way he was greeted by the men, the deference they showed him, told a different story. That's him, Danny said quietly. That's the engineer. I didn't need the confirmation. I could see it in how the man moved, how he carried himself. This was someone important, someone dangerous. We tracked him for 6 more hours, documenting his movements, photographing his face. We sent everything back to intelligence. Within an hour, we had positive confirmation through facial recognition software. The real engineer had been operating from a compound less than 200 meters from where we'd been watching. I was authorized to engage. This time, there was no hesitation. I waited for a clear shot, and when it came, I took it. One shot, center mass 830 meters. The engineer was eliminated. But here's what stayed with me, what haunts me to this day. If I had taken that first shot, if I had trusted the intelligence without question, if I had done what every part of my training told me to do, I would have killed an innocent man, a father playing with his children, and the engineer would have continued building his bombs. When we returned to base, I expected to be court-martialed. I had disobeyed a direct order. I had questioned my superiors. I had laid a time-sensitive mission. Instead, I was called into the commanding officer's office. Colonel Patricia Hendricks was a veteran of 3 deployments, a woman who had earned respect through capability and toughness. She looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "Do you know why you're not in the brig right now, Webb?" she asked. "No, ma'am, because you were right. The initial intelligence was faulty. If you had taken that shot, we would have killed the civilian and sparked an international incident. More importantly, the engineer would still be out there killing our people." She stood and walked to the window. "I've been in the military for 22 years. I've seen soldiers who follow orders without thinking, and I've seen soldiers who think but never act. You did something rare. You thought, you questioned, but then you completed the mission properly." She turned back to me. "That took more courage than pulling the trigger ever would have." But she wasn't done. "However, you need to understand something. The decision you made worked out this time, but it was still a gamble that could have cost lives if the engineer had left before we could reacquire him. Leadership is about making impossible choices with incomplete information. Sometimes you'll be wrong. Sometimes people will die because of your decisions. That's the burden of command." She was right, of course, and that's the lesson that took me years to fully understand. After that deployment, I spent 3 more years in the Marines before transitioning out. I went to college on the GI Bill, got a degree in social work, and eventually started a program helping veterans deal with the moral injuries of combat. Because here's what I learned from that day in the desert. Courage isn't the absence of fear, and it isn't blind obedience to orders. Real courage is the willingness to question, to think critically, even when every instinct tells you to act, and then to bear the weight of whatever decision you make. I've talked to hundreds of veterans over the years, combat veterans, from every conflict, going back to Vietnam, and the ones who struggle the most aren't necessarily the ones who saw the most action or lost the most friends. They're the ones carrying moral wounds from decisions they made or didn't make. There's a Marine I work with now, James. He was a squad leader in Iraq in 2006. His unit was clearing houses in Ramadi during the height of the insurgency. They breached a door, and James saw a figure move in the darkness, raising something toward his men. He fired immediately. It was a woman, holding a baby. The intelligence report later showed that insurgents had been using that house as a fighting position. But the woman and her baby had been trapped inside. James followed his training perfectly. He made the split-second decision that saved his squad, but it destroyed him inside. For years, he told me he wished he'd hesitated just 1 second to confirm the threat. But if he had hesitated, and it had been an insurgent with a weapon, his men might have died. There's no good answer. That's what people who haven't been in combat don't understand. In war, you're often choosing between bad and worse, and you won't know which is which until it's too late. But here's what I tell James, and what I tell every veteran struggling with these decisions. The fact that you're struggling, the fact that you care, the fact that these decisions weigh on you, that's what makes you human. That's what proves you're not a monster. The real tragedy isn't that we sometimes make wrong decisions in the fog of war. It's that we send young men and women into situations where every choice is impossible, and then we're surprised when they come home broken. I think about that farmer in Afghanistan sometimes. I don't know his name. I never will, but I wonder if he knows how close he came to dying that day. I wonder if he's still playing with his children, still working his field, still drinking tea with his neighbors. I hope he is, because that's what all of this is supposed to be about, isn't it? Protecting the innocent. Creating a world where fathers can play with their children without fear, where people can live their lives in peace. But war is a blunt instrument. It doesn't distinguish between guilty and innocent as clearly as we'd like to believe. And the people who bear that burden, who make those life and death decisions, are just human beings trying their best in impossible circumstances. The twist in my story isn't some dramatic revelation or surprise ending. The twist is that the moment I thought would define me as a failure, that moment of hesitation, of doubt, of questioning orders, turned out to be the most important decision I ever made. We're taught as soldiers that hesitation is weakness, that doubt is dangerous, that the mission always comes first. And sometimes that's true. Sometimes you need to act without thinking, to trust your training and your instincts. But sometimes, the most courageous thing you can do is stop, think, question, and accept that you might be wrong. If you've ever faced a moment where you had to choose between what was easy and what was right, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your story. And if you're a veteran struggling with these kinds of decisions, know that you're not alone. There are resources and people who understand. After I left the military, I struggled to find purpose. I had defined myself by my service, by my skill as a sniper, by my ability to make hard decisions. Without that identity, I felt lost. It took years of therapy and self-reflection to understand that I wasn't running from my service. I was trying to reconcile who I had been with who I wanted to be. I had taken lives in service of my country, and I didn't regret it, but I also couldn't ignore the weight of those decisions. Starting the Veterans Program gave me a new mission. Now, instead of taking lives, I was trying to save them. Veterans were dying by suicide at alarming rates, many of them carrying moral injuries that the VA didn't know how to treat. I learned that healing doesn't come from forgetting or from justifying every decision we made. It comes from acknowledging the complexity, accepting the grief, and finding ways to honor the weight of what we've experienced. One of the exercises I do with veterans is called the letter you'll never send. I have them write a letter to someone from their deployment. Sometimes it's to a fallen comrade. Sometimes it's to an enemy they killed. Sometimes it's to a civilian who was caught in the crossfire. The point isn't to send the letter. It's to give voice to the things we carry silently. I wrote my letter to that farmer in Afghanistan. I told him about the day I almost killed him. I told him about his daughter in the blue dress, about his sons playing soccer, about the tea he drank with his neighbors. I told him I was sorry for the danger I represented in his life, even though he'll never know I was there. And I thanked him, because by simply being there, by being human and normal and innocent, he saved me from becoming something I couldn't live with. The lesson I want you to understand, whether you're military or civilian, is this: we all face moments where we have to choose between what's easy and what's right, between following the rules and following our conscience, between acting and questioning. There's no formula for making these decisions, no guidebook that will tell you what to do in every situation. But I can tell you this: the ability to pause, to think critically, to question even your own certainty, that's not weakness, that's wisdom. In the military, we talk a lot about courage under fire, physical bravery in the face of danger. But there's another kind of courage that's equally important: moral courage, the courage to stand up for what you believe is right, even when it's unpopular, even when it puts you at risk, even when every authority figure is telling you you're wrong. That farmer is alive today because I had moral courage in that moment. But I also completed my mission. I eliminated a legitimate threat. I did my job. The two things aren't mutually exclusive. I've been asked many times over the years, what if you had been wrong? What if the engineer had escaped during those extra days of surveillance? What if more soldiers had died because of your hesitation? It's a fair question, and the honest answer is, I would have had to live with that, just like I have to live with every other decision I made in combat, just like every soldier, every police officer, every person in a position of authority has to live with the consequences of their choices. But I'll tell you what I wouldn't be able to live with. Killing an innocent man because I was too proud or too scared to question faulty intelligence. The real enemy isn't doubt, it's certainty. It's the belief that we're always right, that our information is always correct, that the ends always justify the means. I've seen what that kind of certainty does to people. I've seen soldiers become hollow, going through the motions without feeling anything, because that's the only way they can cope with what they've done. I've seen them come home and self-destruct because they can't reconcile their actions with their values. The veterans who heal, who find peace, aren't the ones who convince themselves everything they did was right. They're the ones who can hold complexity, who can say, I did what I thought was right at the time, with the information I had, and I accept responsibility for it. That's maturity. That's growth. That's what separates good leaders from blind followers. Before I continue, if this story is resonating with you, please hit that like button. It helps share these important lessons with others who might need to hear them. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future stories about courage, leadership, and the real cost of combat. I'll end with this. Years after that deployment, I received a package at my office. Inside was a letter from Colonel Hendricks. She had retired from the military and was teaching ethics at West Point. She wrote to tell me that she used my story in her classes as an example of moral courage in combat. But what struck me most was the last paragraph of her letter. I've thought a lot about our conversation after your mission. I told you that you took a gamble, and that sometimes those gambles cost lives. I want you to know that I was wrong. It wasn't a gamble. It was a judgment call, made by a professional who took his responsibility seriously. That's exactly what we need more of in the military and in the world. She was right, and she was wrong. It was both a gamble and a judgment call. That's the paradox of these situations. We do our best, we make our choices, and we live with the outcomes. But we have to make those choices as thinking, feeling, moral human beings, not as machines following programming, not as blind followers of orders. Because at the end of the day, we're all accountable for what we do, not to our commanders, not to our politicians, not even to our country. We're accountable to ourselves, to our values, to the people we want to be. The sniper who couldn't pull the trigger. That's what they called me after that mission. Some people meant it as an insult, but I wear it as a badge of honor, because on that day, I proved that being a good soldier doesn't mean shutting off your humanity. It means enhancing it, using all of your faculties, your training, your skills, your experience, and yes, your conscience, to make the best decision possible. That's the lesson. That's what I want you to take away from this story. Be brave enough to question, wise enough to think, and strong enough to live with the consequences of your choices. That's real courage, that's real strength, and that's what the world needs more of. If this story impacted you, I want to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever had to make a decision that went against what everyone else was telling you to do? Have you ever questioned authority when it mattered most? Your story might help someone else find the courage to do the same. And if you know a veteran who might benefit from hearing this message, please share this video with them. Sometimes we all need a reminder that our humanity is our greatest strength, not our weakness. Thank you for listening to my story. Subscribe for more real combat stories and life lessons from the battlefield. And remember, courage isn't about never having doubt. It's about having the strength to question, even when it's hard. Until next time, stay strong, stay thoughtful, and never stop asking the hard questions.